Good evening and welcome to another session of Maclean's in Conversation. My name is Paul Wells. I'm a senior writer at Maclean's. If you've been watching these, then theoretically at some point you've noticed that I host them. I'm here in Ottawa, and before we start, we want to, as always, thank our friends at the Canadian Bankers Association, who have been our sponsors for as long as we've been doing this. They help make these conversations possible and help us bring them to you, so we're very grateful. Over there in Edmonton is Don Iveson. Hi, Mayor Iveson, how are you?
Hi, Paul. I'm well, thanks.
Don Iveson is the mayor of Edmonton, has been since 2013, won't be for long. He's already announced that he's not going to run for his own re-election, and we'll get a chance to talk about that briefly. But he's here today because he is the chair of the Big City Mayors Conference of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. Federation of Canadian Municipalities is essentially the lobby for Canada's cities and smaller municipalities. And within that group, they have a caucus of big city mayors, which they've decided to call the Big City Mayors Caucus. And it represents 22 of the largest cities in Canada. And for the last few years, Don Iveson has been the spokesperson for that. Why did I invite them? Because this crisis that we're all living through, COVID, and of the various lockdowns, they substantially hit cities and the people living in them in ways that we haven't had a chance to examine in this interview series. And I thought we should fix that by inviting Don Iveson to join us. So once again, thanks for being here. Let's talk a little municipal stuff, like Edmonton stuff, before anything else. You just announced a city plan, which is essentially a strategic plan for the city going forward. It ends up being a bit of a legacy document for you. What does it entail? And how do you envision the Edmonton of the future?
So Edmonton historically has, I guess, had challenges with planning its growth in an orderly fashion. And as a result, it's a very spread out, very car-dependent city in a fairly fractured region with several neighbors. And so on the basis of some much improved regional planning at the metropolitan scale that establishes things like density targets and a backbone for a regional transit network to try to get out ahead of the inevitable traffic congestion that would come without better planning, the city has now sort of capstoned our much improved planning work with a city plan that will guide Edmonton's growth from the roughly 1 million people who live here today to 2 million in the city proper. It will do so within the current boundaries of the city of Edmonton, and it will do so through a mix of higher density new neighborhood development served by better transit, knit together with 50-minute communities that have their own city within a city feel to them, as well as redevelopment of the aging parts of the city with higher density, with more housing choice, and with different transportation options for people, with an eye to keeping housing affordable so that we can be competitive for talent and inclusive and equitable as we grow. So it is the city's strategic plan really for the next 30 to 50 years, as well as a physical growth blueprint for where the buildings go, how we move about, where the infrastructure will go. But in addition to being a carbon plan for the future and a healthier plan for the future that's more inclusive, it's also much more infrastructure efficient. So we've been able to model out that the city will be 8% cheaper to run and maintain because of this attention to intentional planned higher density growth. So whether your angle is fiscal, whether your angle is social, or whether your angle is environmental, it seeks to bring all of those disparate factors into balance for a sustainable and fun city long into the future. So that was a huge effort built ultimately by Edmontonians and their aspirations for the city, and in partnership with private sector partners who actually do a lot of this construction. So I'm very proud of the city plan. It's a great course for the city to set, and with confidence that will be the course the city pursues, I feel able to, after 14 years here at City Hall, contemplate hanging them up. Though, just to be very clear, I've got 9 more months as mayor, and am very, very focused because of the public health and economic challenges we're facing on this role and on this work. And I'm actually thankful I'm not distracted by an election and can really focus on doing what's best for the city in this challenging time.
It must be strange trying to plan for the long term when the short term has been all consuming. I mean, let's cast our minds back now nearly a year. How did your plans for 2020 contrast with the real 2020 that you lived through as mayor?
Well, we were already facing a variety of economic pressures, especially in Alberta. And so those are deeper now because of COVID, but they're also shared much more widely with the rest of the country and the rest of the world. So recovery efforts that were necessary for Western Canada and for cities like Edmonton are just all the more urgent because of COVID. So if anything, it's kind of sharpened focus, but also made possible different things that wouldn't have been on the table in terms of support from senior orders of government. So it's been incredibly disruptive, but all disruption is opportunity. That said, I think something like the city plan was about to come forward for public hearings and approval in the spring of last year, and we had to postpone that and all kinds of other normal business of the city because of the pandemic. And we certainly asked ourselves the question at many stages when we finally got to virtual public hearings and virtual meetings of council later in the fall to consider this essential planning document. We asked ourselves, does this vision still make sense in light of COVID? And had some very thoughtful discussions about that. And I think that those long-term visions, particularly where they bring environment, society, and the economy together, are really even more important as guideposts to make sure that the resources that are deployed as part of recovery here actually achieve all of those aims and are consistent with our long-term objectives for our cities. Because, there may be another pandemic in our lifetime. I sure hope not. But, we will get past this and we'll want to have built better cities and stay on the path of building better cities rather than be set back by this pandemic and a bunch of short-termism coming out of it. So I think it's actually kind of pulled focus in a way on what needs to happen in the very urgent here and now for vulnerable people, for struggling businesses, for job creation, while keeping it in the context at the civic level and hopefully at the provincial and national level of what kind of country and what kind of province and what kind of cities do we want to come out of this as. And I think the city plan still sets a great guideline for that, notwithstanding that we have just been buffeted by extraordinary choppy waters here over the last year, no doubt, especially at the local government level where we have so much less fiscal flexibility than senior orders of government to absorb just the body blows of disruption to our services, which again are essential and life-saving in a lot of cases. It's not like we can take fire service offline because of COVID and our fiscal challenges. If anything, PPE costs are higher, cleaning costs are higher, risks are higher for our employees. We've got more people out sick, and we're not alone in that. Many other businesses and organizations have struggled with this, but municipalities have been no exception to the disruption this year.
Okay. So around the table, around the virtual table of the Big City Mayors Caucus, you have emphasized the need to address housing and homelessness as concrete ways in which the federal government could move relatively swiftly to make mayors' jobs easier. Why is that such a focus?
Well, it's one of these multi-impact investments, which is a fancy way of saying we can solve a bunch of problems at once. Now, I should say that Federation of Canadian Municipalities and housing advocates based especially in our nation's largest cities, where homelessness is not exclusive but largely concentrated, have been advocating an end to chronic homelessness for some time, articulating the value proposition behind housing first, particularly to provinces who would save the most money in healthcare and justice, two of their most expensive cost areas, by taking people out of high circulation in those reactive systems and better meeting their needs with housing with the right supports. And so it was actually Alberta under Ed Stelmach more than a decade ago that was the first province to set the goal of ending homelessness. And I keep in touch with Premier Stelmach, who's a friend and a mentor on this. And he was part of the inspiration because at that point it seemed possible to at least get local government and provincial government aligned with this. Then now we have a national government that, as of the throne speech, has elevated its commitment also now to ending chronic homelessness. And I think the pandemic has brought into sharp relief the fact that it's all well and good to ask people to shelter at home if they have a home. and the risk that frontline workers serving homeless people, and of course people experiencing homelessness, the risks that they experience themselves in a condition like a pandemic and with these economic pressures that we're seeing, it's all just been brought front and center in relief against a public health crisis. But there are hotels that are struggling that could be easily repurposed to housing. There are construction projects, innovation in modular housing to rapidly deliver both job creation and needed purpose-built housing units. And so the federal government's Rapid Housing Initiative commitment is a phenomenal start towards that. We're very hopeful that that can be amplified in the upcoming budget, and hopeful too that provinces who've now been relieved of cost sharing expectations on the infrastructure side, federal government putting the stimulus in to build them, will step up to provide the embedded services, again, against the easily quantifiable savings to healthcare and justice in their jurisdiction for doing so. So the mayors remain committed to this because, we actually talk to people experiencing homelessness outside of our city halls in our community. We work closely with the agency partners. And so, there are the compassionate and human reasons to do this. There are the public policy reasons to do this. There are the perceived public safety issues around social disorder reasons and investment friendliness and of the downtowns of our great cities, reasons to do this. But I can't think of good reasons not to do this, honestly. And especially now, if we're going to create jobs, let's get those multiple bottom line impacts by eradicating homelessness. And I really think that the pandemic has shown us that when, as a civilization, certainly as a country, when we decide to do something with urgency, we can do just about anything. And ending chronic homelessness is unfinished business for me. It's certainly, I hope we'll have it done by this fall, but if it's not done, it's one of those things I'll continue to be active on and a champion like Ed Stelmach in Life After until the job is done. And I believe it can be.
Okay. The scale of the investment that you're calling for is substantial. The Rapid Housing Initiative that you spoke of was announced last fall by the Prime Minister. It's $1 billion to build 3,000 housing units across the country. You have asked for that to be multiplied sevenfold to $7 billion. That sounds like quite a substantial gap between what they're delivering and what you'd like to see.
Well, to credit where credit's due, and that was a pretty significant turnaround even just for the first $1 billion for the first stage, and I've kind of challenged the mayors to see how quickly we can use that up. We've got units under construction now already under this program and hotels under option for the next stage of the program. So I believe we could use several billion more very, very quickly, relieve some hotel owners who are in distress right now. Frankly, the properties are on sale. There's a win-win there, and rebalance supply in the market, which is going to be in trouble for a while. So I think multiple returns to making the investment. It's not just an expenditure. And, in the context of the $40 billion that the federal government's already mobilized as part of the National Housing Strategy, and expecting that some of that $40 billion might actually overlap the ask for $7 billion, I think we can get quite creative to get this done. It will require more money. I think one of the reasons why it does require more investment is that the National Housing Strategy was counting on a lot more active participation from provinces who, despite this being their jurisdiction, were loath to work in this area. Not in all cases. BC and some other provinces are very eager. Other provinces reluctantly have come into partnership with the federal government housing providers. But I do think, I think we all understand provinces are basically broke across the board. And so the federal government stepping up from a 50-50 or a third regime into, look, we're just going to capitalize, all of the construction cost, now leaves the provinces just having to foot the operating, which is not insubstantial, but again, is offset by savings in other areas. So I think that Ottawa can actually use these investments in the infrastructure to counter the requests from provinces for sort of massive top-ups to the health and social transfer on an ongoing basis by saying, well, look, if you make these housing investments on the operating support for these free units we're dropping into your communities and the jobs that we're creating and the tax revenue that you're going to get off that job creation, and then harness your savings, then, do that before you ask us for more money for health and jails, please. So I think there's a reordering that can happen here that will leave both taxpayers and vulnerable people better off, and our cities safer and more inclusive as a result.
Okay. Since this mess began, you're dealing with a new finance minister. Christopher Freeland replaces Bill Morneau, and a new deputy finance minister, Michael Sabia, replaces the guy who was there before. Have you noticed any difference in tone, priority, emphasis in the federal government after these two major changes in personnel?
Well, I worked with them a lot, both, and I have tremendous sympathy for the role of the finance minister. The role of the mayor as the balancer of all the competing priorities in a municipality has some overlap, and so I have some sympathy because sometimes your job is to say no, but your job is also to keep an eye on the big picture. And I think with Christia, it's been really phenomenal because she had spent so much time with the mayors in her intergovernmental work, and really understands the power of cities, listens very closely to John Tory, who happens to be a constituent of hers in addition to the mayor of Toronto, listens closely to all of the mayors, and I think, took our feedback about the challenges we were facing and really, along with Minister Hussein and the Prime Minister, championed this RHI initiative very responsively to what we were saying was an issue for the Rapid Housing Initiative, that is, for what was happening on the ground, and is also very open to the deeper questions about the fiscal fragility of municipalities before the pandemic.
You talk about triangulating the provinces into a restart plan that would work for you. Some people are going to ask, why do the cities and the feds need to work together essentially to wrangle the provinces when the cities are a creature of the provincial governments? Should the federal government simply not increase transfers to the cities, to the provinces, which is the only place it can increase transfers to, and then let you deal with the provinces? I know that you have worked with a federal government led by Stephen Harper that used to make that argument. Why does the current arrangement make more sense as far as you're concerned?
Well, on paper, that is how it should work. And, Rob Ford's Toronto and Don Iveson's Edmonton were the only two jurisdictions that got transit money out of that government, at least in the time that I was working there. And so, I'm happy to work with whatever the terms of engagement are. And we had a supportive provincial government at the time. So ideally, when you've got all three orders of government pulling in the same direction, you can get lots of things done and get them done faster and get them done with greater fairness to all around to taxpayers, I think. But that's not always the case, and we can't control the comings and goings of national or provincial governments. So mayors have to get creative because at the end of the day, the unbuilt infrastructure, the traffic congestion, the unhoused people, the missed economic opportunities, the poor air quality, these things all land in our jurisdiction, and we're forced to find solutions to these issues however we can and work with whoever's willing to work on the same problems that we are. And so we find areas to cooperate with the government of Alberta around jobs and the economy where we're really well aligned, and we find opportunities to work with the federal government on housing, for example, where they are prepared to transmit the dollars in partnership with municipalities. But ultimately, in the case of housing, it's not the portfolio of the city of Edmonton that is enriched by this. It's the housing agencies on the not-for-profit side who will deliver. So they're happy to work with us to advise a sensible portfolio approach and organize the investment. But they'd be the first to tell you that they would like to be able to do that with provincial governments too. And really the challenge is provincial governments that choose not to work with Ottawa or not work with their cities or both that are having to be circumvented in some cases here. And that was frustrating before the pandemic. But I think we've shown during the pandemic that when everyone is pulling in the same direction and the public's not getting mixed signals is when the public is calmest. When governments are pointing fingers at each other is when anxiety is the highest. And that's not what our economy needs right now. That's not what our public health officials need right now. It's not what Canadians need right now. So you work with what you got, you dance with who brung you, and if you've got increasingly, I think the answer is finding a climb down for provinces to come back into a coordinated investment strategy in infrastructure, on finding the advantages and transitioning to a low carbon future. I recognize how dicey and divisive that question has become in the West, but I see opportunity there. And I think it's just crying out for leadership, and that's where the mayors have tried to just keep bringing people to the table to try to get things done. And I will say, though, that the provinces that figure out how to work up and work down and pull in the same direction are going to be the provinces that win, and the people that are the best off in confederation. So I think that's the best incentive for working together, is the results that you leave on the table when you're not working together.
On that score, provinces working up to the federal government and down to their municipalities, what's your evaluation of your relationship with Premier Jason Kenney?
Well, it's if it was a Facebook status, it would be it's complicated, but it always has been for the mayor of Edmonton. I mean, Alberta's tale of two cities, and the struggles and the egos and the wounds going back more than a century between Edmonton and Calgary. I mean, Naheed and I, the mayor of Calgary, Mr. Nenshi, and I have I've talked many times about how much better Alberta would be if we could all get over that. Nonetheless, it is one of the challenges when you're the capital city here, and the sort of dominant seat counts and power bases in the other city, and this moves back and forth in Alberta, and we tear ourselves apart over it. It's an awful sibling rivalry. So to be the mayor of the capital city is inherently more complicated. I won't say more complicated than being the mayor of Calgary. They're tough jobs for both of us, but it's part of the nature of Alberta. But I do think that Edmonton represents a tremendous opportunity for economic resiliency for Alberta. I mean, having the research centers here at the University of Alberta, Dr. Michael Houghton's recent very topical prize, Nobel Prize in virology, Google's DeepMind setting up shop here because they want to be next to some of the brightest AI and machine learning minds in the world, our advanced manufacturing capacity, and being a petrochemical cluster that is really at the front of doing really exciting things with decarbonizing plastics, decarbonizing fuels, and getting to the clean fuel standard. We can point fingers about all of these regulatory imperatives that not just the world but investors are now asking for, or we can lean into, the hydrogen node economy that I think we can build here, which can create, attract tens of billions of dollars worth of investment and keep our products relevant into the future. So we try to find the opportunities to work together with whoever's in power, and we've worked with lots of different governments over the years, and each one has its complexity. But again, as I said, all the problems run downhill to cities, and there's no one left for us to point fingers at. We just have to find opportunities to collaborate, and you win some and you lose some.
It's got to be really dicey. You're chair of a national big city mayors caucus, but and one that is heavily invested in the notion of a new low carbon economy. But your city is the gateway to the oil sands, and I keep hearing from Albertans who say there is just no prospect of new jobs to match the oil sands jobs that are wasting away.
Well, and there is tremendous anxiety about that, but that anxiety is several years old, and I think people are coming to terms with it in different ways. I think more and more Albertans are also sort of gingerly saying, I don't think that boom is going to come back, and that betting on that to come back may be leaving other opportunities on the table, and it might even be turning off investors who might otherwise be interested in us, and turning away talent that might otherwise be interested in the opportunities and the challenges that present here, and the technical capacity that can be brought to bear. The black boxes to make oil sands production more water efficient, more lighter impact on forestry, the application of drones. I mean, there's actually a lot of very phenomenal technology and innovation happening here that is reducing the footprint of today's energy industry. And if we're smart, we can be present in tomorrow's energy industry as it evolves into a lower carbon future. And so I don't think it's an either or. I think the minute these things become black and white, they become kind of intractable. and then are easily exploitable with the politics of fear and division. And what we need is a politics of hope and opportunity, which doesn't mean that the jobs that were booming here 5 years ago are going to come back. It says, what can we make of the assets and the opportunities that we have here in a world that is asking for different things than we were providing 10 years ago, but which we can adapt to be active in and leaders in going forward. So I still have hope for that. I know that Albertans have been energy problem solvers for generations, and I know that in our hearts we have it within us to participate in that and so many other industries going forward that will be our different future than the past that frankly we got to stop holding on to as if it's the only answer.
This is asking you to comment on something that's way outside your bailiwick, but what the heck? How does the new President Biden's rejection of the Keystone XL pipeline fit in with the evolving situation you just described?
Well, as mayor of Edmonton, obviously, we're well acquainted with the challenges of getting Alberta's current products to market and not getting fair prices for Canadians or for Albertans or for producers here. And so that's a setback from that perspective. It's also a decision that is made, and it was quite clear that it was coming, and I'm not sure that there's much else that can be done about it at this point. As chair of the Big City Mayors, that's not a question that we've grappled with just because the lines of division are so unfortunate on it in this country. But one area that the Federation of Canadian Municipalities has taken a position on, and we've been quite active in this through the Western Economic Solutions Task Force, looking at how to help with this transition and how to help with the urgent economic challenges that we have in the West here, is actually borrowing a bit from municipalities, because this project by project regulatory review makes these things subject to massive regulatory risk. And we've seen this with a number of different energy projects over the years. And so, there's lots of politics around the idea of a national energy and utility corridor. But if you're a city, you don't build your city and then put the utilities in after. You plan for where the utilities are going to be on the front end. And so it kind of made intuitive sense when we took the question to our municipal colleagues, urban and rural, east and west, to say, regardless of what kind of linear infrastructure it is, can we all agree it would make sense to have a place to put it so that whatever we need to move, whether it's electrons or hydrogen or fossil fuels, that we have some safe place to do that so that we can reduce regulatory risk and have certainty for people, put all the right risk mitigation in place. So I think there's a proactive planning argument there that has been thoughtfully put forward by the municipal sector around this. That means that whatever infrastructure we need for energy resiliency, energy independence in the future in this country, has a better chance of actually getting to the finish line.
Another element of the Big City Mayor's wish list, obviously, is ever-increasing investments in transit. I want to ask, first of all, is there a bit of a tension, especially in a city like Edmonton, which has tended to grow out and which you hope will grow upward in improving transit, because transit tends to increase the extent to which people can live anywhere.
At intersections for buses, and they may be generations away from rail systems. In mid-sized cities like Edmonton, globally mid-sized, Canadian large, we're building light rail systems. And then our biggest cities are building more subway and heavy rail systems. And the answer is we need all of the above as the country, potentially doubles in population over the next generation or two, just like our city in the city plan is imagined to double over the next 30 to 50 years. We need to put the backbone infrastructure in to keep people moving so that, right now you can drive from the edge of Edmonton to downtown in half an hour, and you'll be able to, when one of these train lines that we're currently building opens up, you'll be able to do it in maybe 25. But in 50 years, when there's another million people competing for how to get around the city, if you don't build that rapid transit, it's going to take 2 hours to drive from the then edge of town. But it would still, if you have the mass transit, only take 25 minutes to get from A to B. In terms of what mass transit can do to catalyze vertical development and safe, walkable, low carbon, healthy, mixed-use communities. I can see right outside my window here a light rail line that's 40 years overdue getting to the town center that was planned around light rail. And there are cranes in the air at a number of stops along that today, and opportunities for tens of thousands of people and businesses to locate stone's throw walkable distance from one of these 13 light rail stations down into Mill Woods. And that will be, of course, billions of dollars worth of real estate development, billions of dollars worth of tax revenue that's very efficient for the city to serve in terms of infrastructure and leveraging existing fire halls and rec centers and so on and so forth. So the multiple returns on the mass transit piece to affordability for people who are less car dependent, to public health in terms of people living walkable lifestyles, to small business in terms of those walkable communities and what that means. I mean, the business case is off the charts. But you got to get all the pieces right too. And so feeding in strong bus networks, electrifying those to decarbonize them, or hydrogen fuel cells, whatever. There's a huge work to do to adapt and modernize our system. And frankly, people, whether it feeds sprawl or not, is a fair debate. But I think you can plan a system that makes sure, as long as you make sure that the new communities you're building are built around transit and higher density, that's not necessarily a bad thing if they're efficient and environmentally responsible in their concept. But I think without the mass transit, you're going to have these highly congested, highly inefficient, highly unhealthy, highly expensive cities with bad traffic and bad air quality. So I prefer the alternative and the jobs we can create right away building this stuff.
And one last question around how the world may have changed. All of these plans on transit, on roadways and stuff, they're based on the assumption that people need to get downtown. Do new technologies like the one we're using now to have this conversation mean that people will be able to work from anywhere and will prefer to work from everywhere, and that's going to have an impact on your planning process?
Well, I think it's too soon to say what the impact to commute patterns and work may be. And shifts to more flexible work may be more family friendly. It may be healthier for people. So I'm open to that possibility. But we're not going to have distributed concert halls. The really good cocktail place over there is not going to be distributed to all of our houses. And Edmonton hasn't bet exclusively on downtown employment for a long time because of the boom and bust cycles in our office marketplace. So, the Rogers Place, the sweet new hockey rink, is down here, and people are still going to come downtown I know I have pent up demand for a nice meal, a night out at the theater, a concert at Rogers Place, a festival in the Civic Square just outside my window here. So I think many of the reasons for people to come downtown into the heart of their city are still going to be there. And that plus a strong residential population. We've more than doubled the number of people who actually live downtown, who provide the baseload demand to support the mom and pop businesses, who we are working like hell to try to keep alive through this pandemic. And the federal government's been great with aid for restaurateurs and folks who've been laid off because of all this. So we want all of that vibrancy to be there. And I think that's what will sustain downtown. And if that's all still there, employers and importantly employees are still going to want to be around that. So we'll change it, but rumors of the demise of downtowns, I think, are greatly exaggerated. And if you think back to the last great global pandemic, it was followed by the Roaring 20s, which was one of the golden ages of cities in human history. And I hope that pent-up demand will mean that downtowns across our country and around the world spring back to life, even if employment patterns change subtly over that time.
The other downtown venue that you didn't mention is the Winsphere Center, the great concert hall in Edmonton. And I've been meaning to check that out for a long time, and plan to next time I get back. I know musicians all over the country are jealous of the musicians who get to play in the Winsphere Center.
I will take you.
I'll as long as I get to pay my ticket, I'll go.
We'll make it ethical. We'll figure it out.
I want to ask about vaccines, because another thing that is necessary for everyone to be able to do things together is that be safe. Are you, as much as the rest of us, essentially a helpless spectator as we try and iron out a national vaccine delivery system that works? And how do you think that's going?
Yes, it's not in my control, so that puts me in very much in the spectator court, but I'm not sure it's in any Canadian's control right now until we have more domestic supply. I think we're at the whims of what happens with global production. But I try to keep two things in perspective. The first is that from a municipal government perspective, and talking to the mayors, we are all standing ready across the country to be of whatever assistance we can to our provincial governments to support distribution. And so I think in the end, a lot of people may remember the end of this pandemic for them happening at a library or at a rec center in their neighborhood. And so, city and using public transit or a mobile center on a bus or something like that. So we will absolutely play our part and move heaven and earth as this ramps up, which it will, to help get this done, because it's in our interest as much as everybody else's to get back to normal as quickly as possible. But we don't control the input factors on that, just the enabling factors when push comes to shove. The other thing I'd say about this, though, is I've been talking to a lot of people about it, and there's a lot of to and fro on why isn't it happening faster and whose fault is it that this is happening or that is happening. And I try to maintain perspective that a year ago, the experts were telling us it could be 4 years till we get a vaccine. And here we are debating, whether September is sufficient and whether March or April for a ramp up. I am just grateful at the massive scientific, I won't call it a miracle because it's human endeavor that has done this. And mostly that has shown, again, that we're, as a species, capable of extraordinary innovation and collaboration when we set our minds to it. So I'm choosing to see the marvel. And if I get it, sooner than 4 years, anytime this year, that's going to be actually pretty amazing. So I'm trying to maintain, and it's hard in this environment, trying to maintain perspective on things like that these are good problems to have. Like, when are we going to get it this year is still amazing.
Yeah, that's probably a good perspective to keep in mind, and a decent optimistic note on which to close out this conversation. Don Iveson, Mayor of Edmonton and Chair of the FCM Big City Mayors Caucus, thanks so much for sharing your perspectives with us tonight.
Thanks for caring about cities, Paul.
And to our friends at the Canadian Bankers Association who sponsor all of these conversations, we also offer our thanks, and especially thanks to you at home for watching. We'll be back soon with another installment of Maclean's In Conversation. Good night.